Thanks as always for listening. This is the second in our two-part series wherein we talk about canon characters and how you can use them alongside player characters, hopefully gracefully. If you want to skip over our introductions and hellos, go to about the 210 mark and we'll get right into the content. Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. We haven't done this in a long time. Good morning, or hello, Chris.
Hello.
That sounded really enthusiastic.
Because I'm like, if I can't talk at the moment.
You can't talk because you're eating hard candies.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you just asked me how things have been. Things have been all right. Life, work, whatever. Our Pathfinder, well, not Pathfinder. I keep defaulting to Pathfinder. Our Kingmaker via Castles and Crusades is proceeding. We did our second session last week, and it's going well. I mean, all of us are still settling into Castles and Crusades as a system. How about you? As you finish chewing.
Yeah, I mean, I still haven't. Supposedly we're all meeting this week, but kind of, I knew I wasn't gonna have time to do stuff. The problem is, like, we were meant to be playing this Icon role-playing game, and like, I read up on it and printed all the stuff, and we looked at making characters. It was like September. It was over a month ago. We didn't meet at all in the whole of October. Yeah. So I can't remember the rules. I can only if I looked at the stuff, maybe I could remember what characters, things they picked, but I'd picked it. We still had to make them finally. I couldn't even remember where I'd put the stuff I'd printed. It's like, I know I printed the stuff, and then
anyway, but let's go ahead and this is the second of a two-part series on use of canon characters, and you were insistent on breaking this into 2 episodes, and I think the more I thought about it, the more I agree with your reasoning. So why don't you go ahead and cue this up and give us our first, like, the focal point that you wanted to start with. You had a point.
Yeah, I just either as I just got in or out of the shower, one or the other. Not while I was in the shower. I was suddenly thought, I want to talk about Conan, because I thought of an analogy. So Conan's, the main character in the whole Conan universe is really Conan. Yes, there are other characters, but most people aren't like hardcore Conan readers, so they're not going to know. Like, everyone's heard of Conan, no one's heard of the other characters in it.
Yeah, like Bellet and others. Yeah,
people like whatever. You could kill them off, and like no one would care because they think they were an NPC anyway, so it's not really an issue. But obviously people have heard of Conan. But a good analogy, I thought, Conan, unless you're actually going to have, like, you're going to play Conan, and as Conan as the character, you got all the stats. Yeah. Conan is crazy overpowered compared to everybody else. So, like, although he said, like, in things like 2D20, there isn't a massive power disparity. Conan probably does have a huge power disparity. Like, he'll have amazing stats. But the analogy I thought of, and think what I would do if I had Conan turn up, have you ever seen any of the Expendables films?
No.
Good, because then this works better. So are you aware of the Expendables films at all?
Yeah, no, I know what the franchise is. I have a very, very vague sense of the gist of the franchise, but I've never seen any of the movies.
So in the second Expendables film, like, Sly Stallone's there with some of his other, like, old action hero people, but they're under fire and they can't get out. And there's been a point earlier in the film where they've like, oh, are we bringing the wolf on this mission? Oh, the wolf's busy. Oh, okay. Because you're like, who's the wolf? You haven't got a clue. Anyways, they're sitting there and they're completely under fire and they're all going to die. And then suddenly, like, some guy in the background just gets killed. And then another guy gets killed. And in the distance, you basically see Chuck Norris. And Chuck Norris turns up, and there's like 20 bad guys. And he just kills them all one by blowing this guy up. He, like, karate chops this other guy, shoots this other guy. And he just takes out all of them. And they're like, oh, it's the wolf. The wolf's come to save us. And they're like, oh, excellent. Thanks, wolf. And he's like, kind of, no problem. He just really, turns them off. And he just walks off into the sunset. That's it. He's not. So the whole rest of the film, they could still do with him. No, he's just gone. He turned up. He saved the day. And then he just walks.
He's not, as in that respect, he's not even a character. He's a very intense plot twist. That's it.
Yeah. And I can imagine doing like that. That's what would be good with Conan. Conan, like, the characters are in a fight that they're really struggling. Conan turns up. He just butchers everyone, and then he kind of goes, by Crom, and then he just walks off. And you Conan, you're like, oh, Conan, can you stay? No,
No,
Conan's not going to
Conan
turn around
doesn't
and
do
talk to you.
autographs.
Yeah, he doesn't do small talk. He's just like, he'll just walk off or get on his horse and he rides off into the sunset.
That's
And
interesting because
it'd be amusing for one scene and
yeah,
then that'd be it.
yeah, you couldn't if you use that more than once or twice,
Yeah,
it
it'd
would
be a
get
one off.
old and stupid. But for those of you who aren't familiar with Modiphius's Conan RPG, which is now out of print, and yeah, sad. Good luck finding the books. That is the physical versions of the books. But if you have any, if you don't have any, you're not familiar with them. Each of the Conan the books, which are kind of like world books, there's Conan the Barbarian, Conan the Adventurer, Conan the Thief, Conan the Convenience Store Clerk. I mean, there's all these different.
I wasn't even supposed to be here today.
Conan the feasibility study project manager, whatever. Each of those Conan the books focuses on a different, call it like strain of Howard's literature, where Howard wrote stories where Conan was primarily a thief, or he was a barbarian, or he was a pirate, or whatever. You remember in all of those books, they stat up Conan as that. So
Yeah.
the writers statted up Conan as they envisioned him when he was a pirate, or when he was primarily a barbarian or a king or whatever. And he's tough. I mean, he's pretty darn badass. But the difference between Conan and a decently experienced 2D20 character in Conan that'd be run by a player is not as great as like your player characters who's fourth level and they run into Elminster.
No.
It's not, that disparity's not there. But I think you've got a good idea, and we'll tease this out as we talk about canon characters in fantasy settings. And you mentioned Forgotten Realms, Middle Earth. Was there another one we wanted to hit on? Or
I said Dragonlance because it's another.
Okay.
But to be honest, I'm not super experienced, but I think I would just a brief thing just to show the difference that even within D&D city settings, there is, in fact, some of the others, there's a world of difference between Dragonlance and say Forgotten Realms, and then something like Eberron.
We can also touch on,
they're all D&D settings, but there's massive differences there.
We can also touch on Greyhawk just a bitsy.
But yes, you feel free. I know nothing.
So actually, let's do this. Let's dispense with Middle Earth first, because then we can bounce around within D&D. I mean, and again, if you didn't listen to the first episode about this, we talked about primarily science fiction, canon characters. How do you use canon characters if they're not going to be player characters? The players aren't going to they're not going to be Han Solo and Leia or Captain Kirk or whatever. How do you, or do you have those canon characters show up in your stories alongside player characters? I think Middle Earth presents some, potentially, depending on your players, some great opportunities, but personally for me, far more pitfalls and problems.
I think it's even harder than Star Wars. I think Star Wars has this clear time period of where we know what's going on and we know kind of who's where. And we have this 20-year period. And then we have another thing of where we know what's going on then. And we have this sort of 20-year gap in the middle where at least stuff's going on.
Yeah.
Whereas in Lord of the Rings, you have the Hobbit, but the Hobbit is really a story of like one. I know in the films they added all this other stuff in, but in the book, it's really like the journey of like a bunch of dwarves and one hobbit. Gandalf turns up and they go on this journey and they get there. Then there's a fight.
Yeah.
And that's it. And then nothing happens for, you said it's close to 100 years. I think, I can't remember. It's more like 100 years than it is 50 anyway. It's a very long time. Yeah. And then the War of the Ring happens. But again, the War of the Ring takes place over, I want to say months, weeks. It's not more than that.
Not sure.
Even the Star Wars trilogy at least takes a place over like 3 or 4 years. There's this like big gap.
The original 3.
Yeah. There's always like the original, virtually all the Star Wars role-playing games say you set it after A New Hope, after the destruction of the first Death Star, and before Empire Strikes Back. Right. You can't even do that in the Lord of the Rings. Once like once Frodo leaves the Shire, that ball's rolling.
Yeah.
And you can't really interfere in that. Anything you do just completely derails. So when the War of the Ring is really, this thing happens and then the ball starts rolling and then it finishes at this point. There isn't much interplay and things you can do within that.
I think what you're getting at here, what I'm hearing is some of the characters in Lord of the Rings, some of the canon characters, by invoking them, and especially if you have like a few of them, you are virtually demanding a certain set of story and plot issues. Like Gandalf shows up in the Shire and Frodo is there. If you're going, unless you want to play fast and loose and stomp all over Tolkien's stories, once you pull the pin on those grenades, you're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like Lord of the Rings is great because of the story that it tells.
Yeah.
It's not the setting, it's
No, I
the
mean,
story.
the
And so
characters are quite cool, but the
once you
characters are
start
good in
telling
that.
that story, yeah, you
Yeah.
box yourself in.
I think some of the characters are interesting, but the characters only really exist within that story. I mean, like the hobbits are all, they're just in the Shire. They're not doing anything.
Right.
They're not going to do anything.
Except for a handful
Aragorn,
of them.
you can play with Aragorn's doing stuff beforehand. Gandalf can always turn up, but
Yeah.
Gimli is in one place for everything before that. Legolas is basically in one place for everything before. So you can't really interact with those characters. Like you can have Gandalf turn up because most people what you do, you set it between the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. But I mean, who's the character? You can go to Rivendell and meet Elrond. Big deal.
It's I think you're right. Is it Lord of the Rings is because of the sequence and the space, the chronological space within those stories. I mean, it's tough. So yeah, I think Lord of the Rings is tremendously problematic. And then you brought up the point. I think as we mentioned it was it last time. I don't know if we were recording at that point, but the idea of just run it in a different age, like that absurd Amazon series. What the hell is it then?
It just feels like you could do more in another setting. So
and back to the canon characters. The canon characters are what they are because of where they fit within that story, and the story uses them to move the plot along. So once you start interacting with them, it's like you get sucked in. It's like you get sucked into a river, and you're just now you're going unless you want to divert the thing. And then my question is, I mean, maybe you and your group of players are like, we don't have a problem completely changing the story of Middle Earth. I'm not going to do that. So I'm satisfied with me personally. I think you just hit it on the head. Middle Earth is a story that people have turned into a game, and that all of fantasy role playing is highly informed by and inspired by. But I actually don't think, because of what it is, I don't think it works very well.
it's just it's there.
It exists as a backdrop for that story, and there's a difference between that and what we can transition to all the different D&D worlds, starting with Greyhawk,
with one
including
exception.
Obviously what.
Let's go with Greyhawk. You said Greyhawk, so yeah. So
okay,
the D&D settings were created to play in.
Correct.
So mostly, because we have one big exception, they don't have stories.
No, and you know what? I think the huge difference between them and Middle Earth, and I won't mention Middle Earth anymore. If I do, yell at me. Is that like Forgotten Realms has lots of stories that take place in it, but they still use Forgotten Realms as a backdrop.
Yes.
Like Middle Earth, without the story of the Lord of the Rings, is nothing.
Yeah, basically.
So, okay, Greyhawk. Greyhawk's the first, it's recognized as the first world. Was built, it was not built deliberately. It wasn't like Forgotten Realms that Ed Greenwood constructed and then sold for a pittance to TSR in the 80s. And it wasn't like Eberron in the early aughts. It wasn't like Dragonlance, which came from a story but was written for the purpose of being so tightly integrated with D&D. I think it's interesting that there are so many, like the whole issue of back to this, the issue of canon characters and what do you do with them? There are a ton of canon characters from Greyhawk, but they don't, in my experience at least, they don't really exist as characters. They exist as things that get mentioned.
Yeah, aren't they
don't
kind of like
show
mostly...
up like Drizzt? Like Bigby doesn't show up.
I'm moaning about Drizzt, and then he's behind me, so I'm hiding him. So
right. No, but think about this. Like Drizzt is this major character in the realms, and so's Elminster. I don't really know any others because I'm not a Forgotten Realms fan. But like Bigby doesn't, Tensor doesn't show up.
I mean, most of
Versus,
these guys, they're like archmages, aren't they? They're like,
yeah,
because
yeah,
they've got
yeah.
spells named after them.
Right. They have spells named after them. And so they're part of the tapestry of like the vibe and the lore of the world. But nobody, I mean, I'm sure people have done this. I'm certain Bigby has shown up and slapped people around with his hand in someone's adventure somewhere. But it's not like Drizzt. It's not like, so the weird thing with the Greyhawk big name characters is you can use them, but you use them as an idea. Bigby doesn't walk through the door. Tensor doesn't float through the door on his disc. So they're less. Greyhawk is, I think, far less of an issue. It doesn't present those challenges.
No, I think Greyhawk's much easier, and I think of a similar thing. It would be like Eberron, Dark Sun. Those are good examples where
Eberron,
there's a world.
Eberron has a handful of canon characters. Like if you go back to the 3.5 ECS book, there are only a handful of canon characters. And aside from the Lord of Blades, none of them they're not presented to be like uber characters. Like, what is it? King Boronel's like 7th or 8th level,
Yeah,
something
those are
like that.
Those are characters that exist in the setting for you to play with.
Yes.
If your players want to off them, that doesn't change the meta plot of the whole world.
No, in fact, it would fit with it.
The whole point of Eberron is kind of like the story happened like, I don't know, 5-10 years ago when there was this massive war and the big thing blew up and the whole city thing got destroyed. And now it's all aftermath. So you can do what you want with that. And if you have intrigue and if people get killed, that's fine. And to some extent, you can do that in Ravenloft because Ravenloft doesn't have stories. It presents a bunch of really interesting characters. And really, you're encouraged to mess with those characters because the characters invariably, with the exception of like the vampire hunter guy, most of the other characters are the lords of the various realms. So like when I did Castle, or whatever it's called, the Strahd one, Curse of Strahd, they met Strahd a bunch of times because Strahd's the bad guy in that story. Now, at the end, they could have defeated him. Okay, that didn't happen because Strahd convinced one of the players to turn on the other player, which was a much more interesting story. But they could have defeated Strahd because it doesn't matter. Defeating Strahd doesn't mean that like all of those Star Wars films we watch don't exist anymore. It doesn't matter. And that's how I see like Eberron and Greyhawk would be a similar thing. If you want to throw in those characters and the players do something silly, that doesn't matter.
The thing though with I'll draw a distinction here. You're right about Eberron. The character like King Boronel and what is it? Queen, I forget her name, of Arenel. Not Arenel, Aundair, sorry, the Queen of Aundair, I forgot her name. None of those canon characters, aside from the Lord of Blades, who's really tough, are so tough that a reasonably experienced party of player characters could not threaten them. Like if you wanted to play a bunch of characters from Karrnath who decide that they've been hired, like they get hired to go kidnap King Boronel and they have to beat up Boronel and his Warforged bodyguard, like that's doable. But you're not going to do that if someone decided to stat up Bigby or Tensor or Mordenkainen. You're not going to do that to them. If the Greyhawk Archmages, which most of them are, if they exist as characters, as statted characters, they're just as challenging as Elminster or Drizzt or Han Solo or whatever. They're just as much of a headache, and we have to go back to, well, how do you use them gracefully?
I'm pretty sure you can kill Han Solo. I've got proof. Do you want me to show you the proof of?
No, you could, but think about this. Like, okay, you're not going to kill Drizzt because Drizzt is uber badass. If you kill Drizzt, that also does something to like the lore of the realms.
Yeah, and I think that's
Han
a difference.
You can shoot Han Solo and kill him, but not without destabilizing or unraveling. You have to create then your own canon. So it's like there's a mechanical side to it, but there's also what weight does this person take up in the story? You're right that the Eberron canon characters are meant to be used, and on top of that, they're not so uber duber that you can't do something with them.
Yeah, I think, and that's where Forgotten Realms do, because there's a lot more books set in Forgotten Realms, and some of them, like Drizzt things, go over hundreds of years. You know, you have the original trilogy, and then they did a prequel trilogy, and then there's some other things that fit in between, and then there's loads more after that, and then they jumped 100 years when they went to fourth edition, and he was still around. And in fifth edition, I'm not even sure there's a set time period anymore.
No idea.
But he's probably still around because he sells books. You could have him turn up again. If I was going to have him turn up, I'd do exactly what I said for Conan. I'd have him turn up, kill a bunch of fools, and just disappear.
Right.
And you'd be like, cool, was that Drizzt? We don't know. It could just be another dark elf with white hair, 2 scimitars, and a black panther.
So you would use it like that, and it would be this incredibly sparing thing that would give the players a cool experience if they're fans of the realms, that like, oh, our characters interact with them. I think if you strike at the right moment with that, it could make for a really cool story element. It would get old very quickly, but it could be used well.
Yeah, Elminster, I think you would use a lot more, but I would use him like Dungeon Master in the D&D cartoon. I would have him turn up at the start, give some cryptic thing that the players need to do, then disappear, and then turn up at the end and go, oh, well done. And you'd be like,
I hate characters like that.
Yeah, and everyone hated Dungeon Master as well, but that would be the point. He would be the. You have got some periods where there are big story, like that whole storyline where the gods came to the earth.
Yeah.
And then, but they kind of like, they came to Earth, they did some stuff for like, a few months period, and then it was all sorted.
The thing I hear people complain about with Forgotten Realms is the wizard, is Elminster, is the ripoff of Gandalf. It's like Gandalf Dungeon Master is what that character seems to be. And again, it can be like a DM who doesn't want to stay out of the game ends up using it to push the players around or the characters around, and that's no fun.
I've hardly ever seen, like, even I've read a bunch of the books. I've read a bunch of books during second edition, but in the second edition, like in campaign sense, he's barely mentioned. He's a good dude that lives in Shadowdale and can do stuff. I've never used him in a game ever.
Good for you.
The way I remember him turning up is there was it started as one book, the Azure Bonds, and this character goes into Shadow and she's looking for Elminster, and she just meets some dude, and they don't call him Elminster at the time, and it's only after she goes, huh, that was Elminster. And actually there he's presented in a really cool way because he kind of turns up, doesn't say who he is, helps this person out in kind of a cryptic way. It turns out to be really beneficial, and he doesn't take any credit or anything. And it's like, and then like right at the end, he turns up and kind of goes, "Oh, well, I'm glad you did the right thing," kind of thing. So I never found that annoying, but I can imagine if people played in games where the DM used him as a
proxy for his own desire to play the game,
then he would be really, really irritating.
Yeah. Let me ask you this: aside from your pop-up, showy, like the Chuck Norris and because that if you did it at the right moment, it would be cool, it would be funny, and potentially would also solve problems by saving your player character's bacon. Aside from that, and aside from having the very powerful canon character be a patron of the group, how else would you use some of these canon fantasy characters from any of the D&D settings?
I think the problem is that the ones we know in things like Forgotten Realms, they are that powerful. We don't have many lower key, less important characters. I think for that we would talk about how they are in Star Wars, where they're not, they're really capable, and you have to watch out how the players treat them. But you would have them bump into them, and they'd use for an episode, and they'd help out. But they, not Chuck Norris things, obviously. But they just be there, or there's someone you meet and you get to go, oh, that was such and such. I think the other thing is, it depends how familiar your players are with a setting. Forgotten Realms is weird because it is a setting, and it's a massive setting. And I did have a decent amount of, 2E stuff. I had the city system from first edition where it was like a bunch of maps, and I had my entire bedroom wall was the map of Waterdeep, and it was amazing. And so then I had a bunch of second editions, and I had like Al Qadim stuff. And
do you have pictures of that anywhere?
No, I don't, because this is before smartphones or anything, and digital.
There were pictures before smartphones.
I know, but like it did.
Maybe not in England. In America, we had pictures before smartphones. A camera was a thing that your parents had a camera. And parents, so my parents didn't. You borrowed the camera, and
so you still had to develop film and stuff. So.
I've got an idea. I've got an idea beyond like so we'll call it like the Chuck Norris usage. Chuck comes in and just kicks ass, because that's what Chuck does. I mean, that would be perfect if used well.
Yeah.
I think also as your characters, because most fantasy games, like mainstream fantasy games, are level games. So I'll just use that structure. As your characters level, as they become more powerful and they become involved in things that are bigger than just like their village, their town, their region, maybe that natural, maybe stereotypical progression where they become more powerful and their influence reaches farther. Maybe you use those characters as story elements from afar. Like, and I'm just making this up off the top of my head. Your characters are, they're involved in the defense of their realm. Okay, so there's a kingdom or whatever, some large polity in which they live. They are now powerful enough to be heroes to defend it against, like, the dragon and undead hordes and all that kind of stuff. And maybe one of these major characters is doing a similar thing in another realm, and so you use that not so much as they don't show up and interact with your player characters, but they become part of the story, and then you don't have to worry about the whole idea of them destabilizing a session and rolling and things like that. But it's just like, oh, you've got this. I don't know, like Dragonlance. I know zip doodle about Dragonlance. I read the first book. So, I mean, are there characters you could do that with, or even Forgotten Realms, other characters?
This is where Dragonlance, I think, is really difficult. Dragonlance, to me, is also very, very similar to Lord of the Rings. There is the War of the Lance.
Okay. Should we leave that out then?
No, I think it's worth mentioning because it is a D&D setting, but it's a D&D setting that comes from this like trilogy of books.
Yeah.
And then there are very key characters in it, but like the characters, interact with each other and do things and go on the story. And there's a big story. And if at any point you interrupt that story, you ruin the story. Story's gone.
Yeah.
So maybe you could have your characters do that story instead of them, which is what I assume some of the the Dragonlance adventures did. You played through the War of the Lance as your characters. Or things are happening. There are things where things happen at the same time. So there'll be points where, all right, well, you were at this battle and then you can meet such and such. But it would really feel like the important stuff's happening elsewhere and you're just like watching from afar.
In a way that sounds like Star Wars.
It does. It sounds a lot like Star Wars.
You benefit from using, and maybe we're touching on something bigger than just canon characters, but canon story, not lore, story and plot. Maybe the challenge is in part finding a way to fit your player characters into a plot, a canon plot that you don't want to mess with too much, because part of the fun of it is we're a part of that too. Our characters are a part of that too, but not in some way that changes the canon to the point where people are like, well, I don't feel like we're really part of it anymore because, like, we shot Anakin Skywalker when he was a kid, and now there's no Darth Vader and that kind of thing. How do you then fit them in? I have no idea if the whole War of the Lance thing, are there gaps of time like between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, for example?
Unlike New Hope, unlike that, where you have this convenient gap that you can play in that gap. And then also you've got that big gap between the prequels and the original films. So you've got places to play in. War of the Lance, I know the original trilogy because I've read some of it and then I've read it all in comic form. It's pretty contained. There isn't max periods of gap. Now, they did do other stories set after that. So you could kind of go, actually, well, we're going to set it after the end of the third book. And then there are other books. And then you probably have got bigger time periods. And okay, not, some of the characters do die, but a lot of the characters survive. And then they're not stupidly high level characters. So, if you go to this place, one of them's running an inn and this other one's still working as an adventurer. And I think when they're not that high level, you can have them, you can go on an adventure with them. Someone, needs the guy's working by himself and he needs other people. I think one of the biggest things, we've not really touched on it, we say it now. One of the biggest things is that what role these canon characters play in your game is how powerful are they? If they're all consuming ridiculously powerful, then they only really work as, like you said, things from afar or quest givers or
Chuck Norris.
If they're kind of medium power, though, it's entirely possible that if they're the same level as power as the players, then they can join you on an adventure, because they're not going to take over the story.
Yeah.
If they're a little bit more powerful, then maybe they should be doing other stuff. So, like recently, the third series of Critical Role, they've repeatedly bumped into characters in the first series, and there's a 20, 30 year gap there. So those character stories are done. They don't have to worry about messing up those characters. Poor Matthew Mercer has to then role play everybody else's characters himself, which is awkward. But you know, then they're kind of like, they're going to them for help. They're in positions of power, so they can go to them for resources. They're getting advice, you know, teleportation from one place to another, bringing key characters back. They're doing the kind of things that just another NPC would do. But you get to interact with them, which is cool, because they're like, oh, cool, I'm interacting with my old character. It'd be the same with, you know, it's the same thrill of interacting with a canon character. Oh, this is really cool. I'm getting to interact with, you know, Han Solo, because he's my favorite character in Star Wars. But this is experienced Han Solo, and you know, he's sending me on a smuggling run. He's going to help.
I would caution though that even I think you're right. You're right when if you're dealing with comparative power levels, you experience you have a set of unique limitations when the disparity, the power, when the NPC is so much more powerful than the player characters. Now, mechanically, you have less of an issue when they're not. However, story-wise, you still have to be careful about, like, well, how does this character, like, you know, if a character that's like of level, an NPC is going to say become part of the, you know, oh, they're going to be with us for a couple of sessions, and you play them in a way that that's satisfying to everybody. You know, if you the GM shield that NPC from getting killed, or you know what I mean, like let's say losing some signature piece of equipment that makes them in the story. Again, that's where, you know, I remember that when we spoke last time about this, the idea of distorting the canon. If you distort it past a certain point, then you're going to lose people, or it's not going to feel. So you've still got that challenge. Mechanically, it works, but you still have to consider how to use them in such a way.
I think it depends very much on the, you know, the story. Like, again, we come back to the same thing. It comes back to the story and the setting. If you're trying to do so, like if you do something and, you know, with Han Solo, the Millennium, well, let's go on fantasy then. If you do something in fantasy, if Dritz loses his scimitars, he always got a bunch of different swords and scimitars. Who cares? He's going to get some other ones. You know, if he dies, that's a problem. But you just don't kill him. It's really easy in a D&D game to just not kill people. They just don't die. So that's not really, you know, that's not so much of an issue. Yeah, when you've got like a particular item, but you just, you know, don't have the enemy attack it, if the players want to be dicks about it, then you just don't do it again in the future, and then it's the players have ruined it. So then it's like, you know, that's the players' fault.
You know, something else too is that if your players care about the canon character, maybe they, you know, that would create some interesting story and gameplay opportunities, because if the character, like for example, Eberron, King Boronel, you know, maybe they have to go rescue King Boronel because he's you know, he got kidnapped by the Karns, and you know, what would a player character who's a professed, you know, Brellish patriot, would they sacrifice themselves for Boronel? Would they, you know, then it becomes, then because the NPC is not so grossly overpowered that they, you know, they don't need any help. And it would be stupid if you're like, well, Boronel's tied up and he's like a 20th level character, and you know, somehow he can't get away on his own. That seems kind of goofy. That then distorts what that NPC is. But that could make for some interesting play as well. I just think it's hard. I mean, one of the things that makes characters make stories interesting. Like there are stories that the plot is really compelling, but I find personally a story that has a great like idea to it, a plot and a backdrop and events, you still need at least decent characters. You need characters that you give a crap enough about.
100%. The amount of TV series I've like stopped watching, and Mika's had to watch by herself, because I've gone like, I like the theory of this program, but I hate the characters.
Yeah.
If I don't like the characters, I can't watch it. There needs to be characters that I can buy into it and I enjoy, and I'm like, I like that guy.
Yeah, there's a floor.
Or characters at least that you hate, you know, the character that you love to hate. Like Game of Thrones is full of characters that I absolutely just hope die, but I'll tune in week after week hoping that they will die. And invariably they all did. All the really horrible, despicable characters get offed. So it's good. You get, you know, they get their comeuppance. But yeah, if you watch something with incredibly bland boring or whiny characters, or just characters that just win all the time, then it's, you know, it's not as much fun.
Yeah.
It's better when character. I mean, that's always the issue I have with Superman. I can never be a big fan of Superman because he
Stupid.
seems so infallible.
Yeah.
And actually, I think in the comics they try and make him not, but in the, you know, in the films, it was different. Christopher Reeve did a really good job, so you bought into Christopher Reeve. I buy into Henry Cavill, but Superman as a character, I just like, it's hard to buy into.
And again, that's a story. That's not a game that is a collaborative story building exercise. Like I said, my view on this is I think there are some opportunities. I think that you need to be really clear as a GM on like where your players are, like how much of cannon hawks are they, first off.
Yeah.
Period. And how willing are they to rewrite things? Where's the limit? And you know what, the other thing too is I think it's really important. I don't buy into this whole. I think this is it's a contemporary, and it's reflective of culture now, but that like the characters are always awesome, and the player characters are always awesome, and be awesome. You're awesome. You're like it's like freaking cult of self-esteem. It gets so tiring. And your point about like when everything's too easy and there's no sacrifice and there's no risk, you lose things very quickly. I'm very leery of that, but at the same time, I don't want some like uber duper NPC to come in and shine so brightly that the player characters are like, why the hell are we here?
Yeah.
So I think like me. Go ahead.
When you're doing that, it needs to be kind of, you know, the second scene of a bunch of scenes. It shouldn't happen. Definitely shouldn't happen at the end. That shouldn't be your climax.
Nope.
It could be your opening scene, but it's the kind of it's a fun scene that you can, like you said, you get away with once. You just can't keep doing it.
You know, it's like years ago in the 90s, and boy, I don't want to go off on a tangent on this, but if you listen to especially like rock and metal from the 90s, there's the recordings are very loud. All the instruments are very loud. There's not a lot of dynamic range inside the music itself. I'm not talking about the volume of the music. I'm talking about the volume of the separate instruments relative to one another. And a lot of it sounds like shit because there's no nuance to it. Like you can't have the dark without, like, the dark and the light, the warm and the cold, the good and the bad. Like, you need contrast. And if everything is awesome all the time for the character, that just gets boring. But I think, again, you bring in one of these canon NPCs, they shine brightly or darkly if they're evil. And that provides this great stark story contrast. And then they leave, because if you keep them around, it's like loud, and then it becomes boring because there's no peak. There are no natural peaks and valleys to the plot and the feel. So tread lightly is what I say.
Yeah, I definitely think. However, if you play in a world with a clearly defined story, that's really hard. If you just play in a world with clearly defined characters, that's still difficult, because those characters have got to act like they do. Otherwise, players are going to be like, well, that's not what they would do. Well, that's the worst thing a player go, well, that's not what such and such would do.
A couple of years ago at a game convention here in town, I know I've mentioned this before, but I had two players get really, like, I had to calm them down because they started to get really peeved peeved is a nice word, at each other over their very different interpretations of like warp core maintenance and like how to fix the ship's warp core. Oh, that's not how it works. I'm like, none of it works. It's not real. But yeah, you need people on the same page about that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
when dealing
with. I
think
that's the thing. If you introduce, you need to know how invested your players are in the characters and how well they know them.
Yeah, and
then you have to kind of have an idea with your players of, do they want this even to happen?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same as it came back to a similar thing. It is about the story and the system and the setting, but it's also about a conversation with your players. If you just don't talk to your players and just throw a bunch of stuff, and some players might not mind it if an NPC derails, because in the end, a lot of the stuff we said isn't just about canon characters. It's also about NPCs. You can just have some GNPC turn up and do all of this stuff.
Yeah. You could create that in your own setting,
exactly,
and not even do it deliberately. Like, oh, I'm going to create like, you know, Billminster, and that's my super mage or whatever, Big Meister. Oh, that sounds like some like race car driver. Whatever. Anyway,
I mean, I've had a lot of, when we play a lot of role playing games, I have like GMPCs because we only have 2 players.
Yeah.
So I have someone else. So then now it's a party of 3, and I can either fill in a gap, or it just makes, you know, in a 5e type thing, it makes the action economy work a bit better, and all this kind of stuff, you know. But then I'll do things so they disappear and think it's the hacker who stays in the van.
Yeah.
Because they haven't got the hackers. They're not getting involved in it. They're not doing the talking. They're not doing the important stuff or the fighting. But if they need hacking doing that, they're in the van. You know, when I did the Straden, I had my character was like a mute person. It was an extra. They didn't do any talking because they couldn't talk. But in combat, it gave them an extra body. So it was, you know, all of those kind of things.
You know, I see here, and I'll close with this because I feel my tendency to go on like wild tangents growing, and so I'm going to resist. But I see in this, you have great opportunities in using an established setting, whether that's a setting based in literature that's been gamified or one that was built to be a setting. So, and I'll just use the word canon to mean something that someone else wrote.
Yeah.
And is available to anyone who wants to buy the stuff. There are great opportunities in using canon because of shared understanding and because it takes a lot of weight off you as a GM. There are also pitfalls.
Yeah.
We just talked about them, and you're right. Actually, it's beyond just canon characters. It's canon plot. It's canon vibe. You know, you ruin there are some ways you could ruin Dark Sun and Heartbeat, and then it's not Dark Sun anymore.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, it's very much a risk reward thing, isn't it? Your players can get a real kick out of seeing some of these people that they know really well and that they have an invested interest in, and it's probably easier to make them go off and rescue a character that they, you know, are really in love with. But it can all go horribly wrong as well.
Yeah. All right. So GMs, there's our advice.
Yep.
We hope it serves you well. And you know what? Honestly, I would love to get comments because, you know, this is going to go up. This is YouTube. This is on YouTube, and this is also on our audio podcast. I would love to get comments and thoughts on this. What have you done with canon characters in any kind of setting or story? We'd love to get some kind of conversation going either on our Discord or as comments on the YouTube version of this. Thank you so much for listening. You can visit our show's homepage at anchor.fm/fluffncrunch. That's FLUFFNCRUNCH. We would really appreciate feedback and reviews on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to this on. Thanks so much.